December 31st, 1958, Havana, Cuba. 11:52 in the evening. The Riviera Hotel casino is full. Every table is occupied. The roulette wheels are spinning. The dice are moving across green felt. The chandeliers are throwing light across the faces of 300 people who have dressed carefully for this evening, who have traveled from Miami and New York and Mexico City and London for exactly this, for the particular electricity of New Year's Eve in Havana, which is unlike New Year's Eve anywhere else on Earth. The band is playing. The champagne is open. The air smells like cigarettes and money and possibility. At a corner table, slightly removed from the main floor, a small, precise man in a conservative dark suit is watching all of it. He has a glass of water in front of him, untouched. He is not celebrating. He is not even particularly present in the way that most people in the room are present, which is to say, he is not here for the evening. He is here for the information. He is watching the crowd, the way a doctor watches a patient, looking for the specific signs that tell him what is actually happening beneath the surface appearance of health. His name is Meyer Lansky. He is 56 years old. He has spent the better part of the last decade building the most profitable entertainment operation in the Western Hemisphere, right here in this city, in this hotel, and the 6 others he has transformed from modest establishments into destinations that people fly across oceans to experience. The Riviera alone is generating revenue that would embarrass most legitimate corporations. The combined operation, the hotels, the casinos, the ancillary businesses, the supply chains and the service contracts, and the financial arrangements that hold it all together, represents somewhere in the neighborhood of $300 million of accumulated value. At 11:58, 2 minutes before midnight, Meyer Lansky finishes his glass of water, stands up, buttons his jacket, and walks out of the Riviera Hotel casino. He does not say goodbye to anyone. He does not make a speech or mark the occasion. He simply walks out, gets into a waiting car, and is driven to the airport. His bags are already there. They have been there since that morning. He boards a plane to Miami, and as the plane climbs above the lights of Havana and banks north over the Straits of Florida, Meyer Lansky looks down at the city he has spent a decade building into something extraordinary and feels, more than anything else, the specific satisfaction of a man who has finished a calculation correctly. He already knows what almost nobody else in that casino knows yet. He already knows that the man those 300 celebrating people are drinking champagne to keep out of their minds, the man in the mountains with the beard and the Revolutionary Army, is not going to stay in the mountains. That the government those 300 people are trusting to protect their evening is, as of this particular midnight, finished. That by morning Havana will be a different city, and by next week it will be a different country, and the empire he has built here will be gone. What he also knows, what makes him feel that satisfaction rather than the grief that any reasonable person might feel at losing everything they have spent a decade building, is that the empire is not gone. The physical hotels are gone. The casino equipment is gone. The staff and the operations and the beautiful chandeliers and the green felt tables are gone. But the money, the real money, the processed and structured and carefully moved capital that represents the actual value of what he has built here, that is somewhere else entirely. It has been somewhere else for months. Because Meyer Lansky saw this coming before almost anyone, and he spent those months doing the one thing he is better at than any other person alive: moving money. This is the story of how he did it, of how one man read a political situation more accurately than the CIA, more accurately than the State Department, more accurately than the Cuban government itself, and used that accuracy to save $300 million from a revolution that everyone else was convinced would never happen. To understand the Cuba story, You have to understand what Havana was before Meyer Lansky got there. Because the Havana that existed in the late 1940s, when Meyer first begins to see what it could become, is not the Havana that most people imagine when they think about the golden age of Cuban tourism. That golden age does not exist yet. It is waiting to be invented. Havana in 1948 is a city with serious tourism infrastructure and serious tourism potential that is being dramatically underutilized. There are hotels, some of them quite grand. There is gambling, because Cuba has legalized casino gambling. There is nightlife and music, and the particular tropical beauty of the city, the malecón along the seawall, and the colonial architecture of the old city, and the warm Caribbean evenings. All of this exists, but it exists in a fragmented, uncoordinated, undercapitalized way that captures perhaps 20% of its actual potential value. Meyer Lansky arrives in Havana and immediately sees the other 80%. He has already had a significant history with Cuba before the construction phase begins. In the 1940s, he has established connections with Fulgencio Batista, the military strongman who controls Cuban politics in a shifting and complicated way throughout that decade. The relationship is straightforward in its structure, if not in its implications. Meyer brings capital and expertise. Batista provides political protection and the legislative framework that allows casino gambling to operate at the scale Meyer has in mind. They understand each other's needs clearly, and the arrangement works. When Batista returns to power in 1952, after a period in Florida, the conditions for the larger project Meyer has been planning become fully available. Batista is now president again, and he is specifically interested in developing Cuba's tourism infrastructure as an economic priority. He passes legislation that matches government investment dollar for dollar with private hotel construction investment. He creates favorable conditions for foreign capital. He is, in short, offering exactly the partnership that Meyer Lansky needs to build the thing he has been imagining. What Meyer builds over the next 6 years is not a collection of casinos. It is a complete entertainment ecosystem. The Riviera Hotel opens in 1957, 13 floors of modernist architecture directly on the Malecón, the most sophisticated casino operation in the hemisphere. The Nacional, the grand dame of Havana hotels, is transformed under his management into something that makes the original look modest. Other hotels, other casinos, a supply and service network that supports the entire operation. In total, the investment represents hundreds of millions of dollars and the employment of thousands of Cubans in every capacity, from dealer to manager to chef to musician. The operation is, by every measurable standard, a success. The revenue numbers from the mid-1950s Havana operation are extraordinary. The Riviera alone generates returns that justify its construction cost within 3 years of opening. The tourist traffic that Meyer's investment attracts to Cuba creates economic ripple effects throughout the city and the island. Hotel occupancy, restaurant revenue, the taxi drivers and the cigar makers and the performers and the dozens of industries that profit from a population of wealthy international visitors who have been given a compelling reason to come to Havana rather than going somewhere else. Meyer Lansky, at the peak of his Havana operation, roughly 1956 to 1958, is running something that looks, from the outside, almost indistinguishable from a legitimate international hospitality corporation of the first rank. The management structures are professional, the service standards are high, the financial reporting is disciplined. The difference between Meyer Lansky's Cuban operation and a company like Hilton or Marriott is not visible in the day-to-day operation of the hotels. It is visible only in the source of the original capital and the destination of a portion of the profits. And then the mountains begin to move. Fidel Castro is not a new figure in 1956 when he lands in Cuba from Mexico with 82 men and begins what will become the Cuban Revolution. He has been a political figure for years, a lawyer and activist who has been agitating against Batista since the early 1950s. The landing in December 1956 is a military disaster at first. Of the 82 men who land, most are killed or captured within days. Castro escapes into the Sierra Maestra Mountains in eastern Cuba with roughly 20 survivors. Most people who follow these events conclude that the revolution is finished, that 20 men in the mountains cannot seriously threaten the Cuban government. The CIA's assessment is that Castro represents a manageable insurgency. The State Department's assessment is similar. Batista's government is stable enough to contain the threat. The business community in Havana, including the international investors and the hotel operators and the casino managers who have built their operations on the assumption of political stability, concludes that business continues as usual. Meyer Lansky does not conclude this. Meyer Lansky looks at the same information that the CIA has, that the State Department has, that Batista's own intelligence services have, and he reaches a different conclusion. Not immediately, not from the beginning. He watches carefully for months, accumulating data, reading the signals that most people are not reading or are not reading correctly. What he sees is not primarily military. He is not a military analyst, and he does not try to assess the revolution's prospects from a strategic or tactical perspective. What he sees is economic and social. He sees the Cuban population. He watches how ordinary Cubans respond to news about the revolution, how they talk about it in the hotels, in the streets, and the markets. He watches the Batista government's responses to the insurgency, and he reads those responses not for their official content, but for what they reveal about the government's actual confidence level. He has informants throughout Havana and beyond, not a formal intelligence network, but the informal network of relationships that any person builds when they have been operating at the center of a city's economic life for a decade. Taxi drivers and hotel workers and government officials and journalists and businessmen. People who tell him things not because he has asked them to report, but because they talk to him the way people talk to someone they trust and respect. And what they tell him, consistently and from multiple independent directions, is something that the official assessments are missing. The official assessments are measuring the revolution's military strength against the government's military strength, and concluding that the government will win. Meyer is measuring something different. He is measuring the revolution's moral authority against the government's moral authority, and what he finds there is a very different calculation. Batista's government is corrupt in the specific and thoroughgoing way that makes governments ultimately unsurvivable. Not corrupt in the sense of taking money, because taking money is universal and survivable. Corrupt in the sense of having lost the basic transaction with the population that justifies a government's existence. The people who live outside the hotels and the casinos, the ordinary Cubans who have not benefited proportionally from the economic development of the 1950s, who have watched foreigners and a small Cuban elite accumulate spectacular wealth while their own conditions remain largely static, those people are not merely neutral about the revolution. They are quietly, carefully, increasingly sympathetic to it. Meyer Lansky understands this because he has seen it before. He grew up in a community that understood what it felt like to be outside the official structures of power and prosperity. He has spent his entire professional life operating at the margins of legitimate society, which gives him a specific kind of insight into the relationship between official power and the populations that tolerate or resist it. He knows what it looks like when a government has lost the basic consent of the people it governs, even when those people are not yet acting on that loss. He has seen that look before. He sees it in Cuba beginning in 1957, and by early 1958 he has made his assessment. The revolution will succeed. Not necessarily soon, not necessarily this year, but the direction of travel is clear and it is not reversible. Batista is governing a country whose population has already decided, at a level below political action, that it wants something different. The only question is timing. The question of timing is the only thing that matters to Meyer Lansky at this point, because timing determines how much of what he has built he can save. He begins the process of moving assets in the spring of 1958. This is the part of the story that has almost no documentation, because it is conducted with the same deliberate invisibility that characterizes everything Meyer Lansky does when he is doing something he does not want recorded. But the broad outlines can be reconstructed from what is known about the financial architecture he operates within, about the specific mechanisms he uses, and about the state of his finances when the revolution arrives versus the state of the physical assets he leaves behind. The physical assets cannot be moved. The Riviera Hotel is a building. It is 13 stories of concrete and glass and marble sitting on the Malecón. And when the revolution comes, it will be exactly where it is, and it will belong to whoever controls Cuba. Meyer knows this from the beginning, and he does not waste energy grieving it. What can be moved is the capital, the money that the hotels and casinos have generated, the accumulated profits of a decade of operation, the working capital and the reserves and the investment accounts that represent the actual financial substance of the empire. The mechanism for moving this money is the mechanism Meyer has been developing and refining since the 1940s. Money generated by the Cuban operations flows through a series of transactions that progressively distance it from its source. Some of it moves through legitimate Cuban businesses that Meyer has interests in, emerging as business revenue with a clean record. Some of it moves through the financial relationships he has maintained with banks in Switzerland and the Bahamas, institutions that operate under secrecy laws that make tracing deposits extremely difficult. Some of it moves through the complex web of loans and investments and corporate structures that Meyer has built over decades precisely for situations like this one. Situations where money needs to travel a long distance in a short time without leaving a trail. By the standards of modern financial crime investigation, what Meyer is doing in 1958 is enormously complex. By the standards of what he has been doing for 30 years, it is simply his normal operation, executed with additional urgency. The urgency requires trusted people. Meyer has them. The network of couriers and lawyers and financial intermediaries and bank officers that he has cultivated over decades is now put to specific and intensive use. People travel, documents are signed, transfers are made, accounts are opened and funded and connected to other accounts through structures that will take investigators years to begin to trace, and that he has designed to be ultimately untraceable. He is doing this while simultaneously managing the active operation of the hotels and casinos, because he cannot stop operating without creating exactly the kind of visible signal that would accelerate the very crisis he is trying to manage. If Meyer Lansky suddenly withdraws from his Havana operations in mid-1958, it tells everyone watching, and many people are watching, that someone with access to the best information in the city believes the situation is not salvageable. That signal would itself destabilize the situation, potentially accelerating the timeline in ways that would give him less room to work. So he continues to operate. He continues to manage. He continues to attend the meetings and review the revenue figures and make the management decisions that the operation requires, while simultaneously, through channels entirely separate from the day-to-day operation, dismantling the financial foundation of everything he is visibly managing. This is a particular kind of discipline that requires holding two completely contradictory postures simultaneously. Outwardly, he is the operator of a thriving and growing entertainment empire, invested in its future, committed to its continued success. Inwardly, he is executing the controlled demolition of that empire's financial substance, piece by piece, in a sequence designed to be undetectable until it is complete. The people around him, his managers and his staff and his business associates in Havana, mostly do not see it. The people in the financial network, the lawyers and intermediaries who are executing specific pieces of the transfer, each see their own piece, but not the whole. Only Meyer sees the whole. Only Meyer understands the complete picture of what is being moved where and at what pace, and through which channels and in what sequence. This is by design. The invisibility of the operation depends on no single person outside of Meyer himself having a complete view of it. By late summer 1958, the majority of the movable value has been moved. Not all of it. The process takes time and has natural limits. But the bulk of the accumulated capital that represents the real value of the Havana operation is no longer in Cuba. It is in accounts and structures and arrangements that exist in jurisdictions where the Cuban Revolution, when it arrives, will have no legal reach. And then he waits. He continues to operate. He continues to be present. He attends the New Year's Eve celebration at the Riviera because being absent from the most visible event of the year would itself be a signal. He sits at his corner table, and he watches the crowd, and he waits for midnight. When midnight comes, he walks out, and the revolution comes with him almost simultaneously because Batista flees Cuba in the early hours of January 1st, 1959, and by the time the sun comes up over Havana, the city is no longer the city that Meyer Lansky built his empire in. The revolutionary committees move quickly. Within days of Castro's forces entering Havana, the casinos are shut down. The Riviera Hotel, the Nacional, the other properties that Meyer has spent a decade building are seized by the new government. Foreign operators are expelled or departed. The infrastructure of the entertainment empire that took a decade and hundreds of millions of dollars to construct is dismantled in a matter of weeks. What the revolutionary government finds when it takes control of the financial records of Meyer Lansky's Cuban operations is, from their perspective, deeply puzzling. The operations have been profitable. The revenue figures support this. But when they look for the accumulated profits, for the reserves, for the capital that should correspond to a decade of strong revenue, it is not there. The accounts are present, but thin. The structures are present, but empty. The money has been somewhere else for months. This discovery, when it is made, generates a kind of institutional fury that will follow Meyer Lansky for the rest of his life. The revolutionary government makes clear that they believe, correctly, that substantial funds were removed from Cuba in the period before the revolution. The American government, which has its own reasons for being interested in the question of where Meyer Lansky's money went, pays close attention to this claim. The FBI files from the early 1960s include extensive analysis of the Cuba situation, of what is known and what is theorized about the pre-revolutionary asset transfers. What they find is almost nothing. Not because the transfers did not happen, but because they were conducted by a man who had spent 30 years learning how to move money invisibly, and who had prepared for exactly this investigation with exactly the same care that he had applied to every other aspect of the operation. The Havana hotels stand. They still stand today, the Riviera and the Nacional and the others, operating under Cuban government management, carrying in their architecture and their interiors the visible evidence of what Meyer Lansky built there. The marble and the chandeliers and the design sensibility that made them destinations rather than simply accommodations, all of that is still there. The physical empire is still there, owned by someone else, serving a purpose that its builder did not intend. But the financial empire, the real empire, the $300 million of accumulated value that was the actual point of everything, that went where Meyer sent it. That went somewhere the revolution could not reach. There is something Meyer Lansky says in an interview conducted several years after Cuba, when he is asked about what happened there, about the loss of everything he built. He says, that he did not lose everything. He says that what he lost in Cuba was the furniture. He built the furniture, and he left it behind. What he did not leave behind, he says, is the house. The house went with him. The interviewer does not entirely understand what this means. Meyer does not explain further. But what he means is exactly what the financial record subsequently demonstrates. The furniture is the hotels, the tables and the chandeliers and the staff uniforms and the casino equipment and the beautiful modernist architecture of the Riviera on the Malecon. All of that is furniture. You build it, it gives you a place to operate, and when the operation ends, you leave it behind, because you cannot put it on a plane. The house is the money, the capital, the accumulated value that the furniture helped generate over the years it stood and functioned. The house is what you actually have. And the house, if you have been careful and patient and clear-eyed about the political situation in the country where your furniture sits, goes with you. Meyer Lansky came to Cuba with capital and expertise and a vision of what could be built there. He built it. He ran it for a decade. He extracted from it everything that could be extracted and moved everything that could be moved. And when the revolution came, he walked out with what mattered and left behind what could not be carried. That is the Cuba story in its complete form. Not the story of loss that it is usually told as. The story of a man who understood, earlier and more clearly than anyone else, that what he had built was temporary, and who prepared for the end of it before anyone else believed the end was coming. The lesson that Meyer Lansky draws from Cuba, and that he carries for the rest of his life, is a lesson about the nature of physical empires versus financial ones. Physical empires are vulnerable. They exist in specific places. They can be taken. Governments change and laws change and armies move, and the specific political arrangements that made your hotel profitable on Tuesday can be replaced by revolutionary committees on Wednesday, and there is nothing you can do about it. Physical assets, no matter how magnificent, are ultimately at the mercy of the place they occupy. Financial empires, properly constructed, are different. Money properly structured does not occupy a specific place. It exists in relationships and records and legal arrangements that can be distributed across jurisdictions, that can be moved when movement is necessary, that do not have a fixed address that a revolutionary army can march to. The money Meyer Lansky moves out of Cuba before the revolution does not stop existing when Batista falls. It simply exists somewhere else, under structures that Castro's government has no legal access to, and that the American government's investigators will spend decades failing to trace. He builds that kind of empire. Not the visible one, not the Riviera with its chandeliers and its Malecon view, though he builds that too, and it is genuinely magnificent. He builds the invisible one, the one that cannot be seized, the one that goes where he goes because it is not attached to any particular place on the map. When Meyer Lansky steps off the plane in Miami on the morning of January 1st, 1959, he is a man who has just watched everything he built physically in a decade disappear overnight. He is also a man who is, by any honest financial accounting, considerably wealthier than he was when he first flew to Havana to meet with Batista 10 years before. The revolution took the furniture. The house is intact. He goes back to Miami. He goes back to his apartment and his routine, and the modest, visible life that has always been the surface over which his actual financial life moves invisibly. He reads the newspaper accounts of the Cuban Revolution. He watches the CIA and the State Department scramble to understand what happened and why their assessments were wrong. He watches the American government freeze Cuban assets and threaten intervention and try to manage a situation that has already moved well past the point where management is possible. And somewhere in that watching there is, for Meyer Lansky, the private satisfaction of a man who knew, who ran the numbers when no one else was running them, who saw what was coming and prepared for it, and was correct. That satisfaction is not loud. It is not something he discusses or demonstrates, but it is there. The satisfaction of precision, of seeing clearly and acting on what you see before the consequences of not acting become unavoidable. Cuba ends. The empire ends. The furniture stays in Havana and slowly takes on the patina of a different era, a different system, a different story than the one Meyer Lansky wrote for it. But the house moves on with him, the invisible structure, the financial architecture that the revolution cannot reach and the FBI cannot find, and the IRS cannot attach to any specific taxable event. $300 million, built in Cuba, removed from Cuba before Cuba changed, existing now in the particular nowhere that properly structured financial instruments occupy, which is everywhere and nowhere simultaneously, which is safe from every specific threat because it is not in any specific place where threats can reach it. That is the Cuba escape, not a dramatic flight, not a man running for the airport with cash in a suitcase, a quiet calculation executed over months with patience and precision that moved the substance of an empire out of reach before the empire's physical form was taken away. Meyer Lansky at his most characteristic. Meyer Lansky doing the thing that no one else could do as well as he could do it. Reading what was coming, moving what mattered, leaving the rest behind with the equanimity of a man who always knew the difference between furniture and house, and walking away clean into the Miami morning while the revolution took the chandeliers. If this story about the most sophisticated financial escape in the history of organized crime, about the man who read a revolution more accurately than the CIA and moved $300 million before anyone else knew to look, moved you, subscribe to this channel. Because the full story of Meyer Lansky is bigger than any single chapter. Drop a comment below. Tell me what you think happened to the money after Cuba. Where did it go next? And remember this, the most important thing you can build is the thing that cannot be taken from you. Meyer Lansky understood this, and he built accordingly. There is a detail about the Cuba operation that almost never appears in the standard accounts, and it is the detail that most completely reveals who Meyer Lansky was at the level beneath strategy and finance. It is a detail about the people he left behind. When the revolution came and the hotels were seized and the foreign operators departed, the Cuban staff of Meyer's operations faced a sudden and disorienting transition. The dealers and managers and kitchen workers and security staff and the hundreds of other Cubans who had built careers within the infrastructure of the Lansky hotels found themselves working for a revolutionary government that had very different ideas about how hotels should be run. Some of them lost positions entirely. Some of them were reassigned to roles that had nothing to do with their training and expertise. The highly specialized knowledge they had accumulated, the particular professional competencies that made them valuable in the specific context of a sophisticated international hotel operation, became largely irrelevant in the context of post-revolutionary Cuba. Meyer Lansky knew this would happen. It was not something he could prevent, and he did not attempt to prevent it, because there was nothing to prevent. The revolution was going to happen regardless of what he did about his staff's future employment. But he did something that most people in his position would not have done, which is that he thought about it. He thought about the specific people who had worked for him and what their situations would look like after the transition, and what, if anything, he could do for them within the limits of what was actually possible. What he does is quiet and uncelebrated, and mostly unrecorded, except in the memories of the people it affects. In the months before the revolution, while he is executing the financial transfer and managing the active operations simultaneously, he is also identifying specific individuals within his Cuban staff, people who have particular skills and particular qualities, and he is helping them. helping them in the practical and specific way that Meyer Lansky helps people, which is to say, financially and structurally rather than dramatically or visibly. Some of them are helped to get visas and travel documents that allow them to leave Cuba if they choose. Some of them are helped with money, with the kind of specific financial assistance that allows a person to start over in a new place rather than arriving with nothing. Some of them are helped with connections, with introductions to people in Miami or New York or elsewhere who can use their skills and who Meyer trusts to treat them fairly. He does not do this for everyone. He cannot do it for everyone, and the selectivity is its own kind of limitation. But he does it for the people he can, with the resources he has available, within the window of time before the window closes. It is the act of a man who understands, in some fundamental way, that the people who worked for him were not simply instruments of his operation, but human beings whose lives have been affected by choices he made, and who owes them something beyond the salary they received while the operation was running. This aspect of the Cuba story is not well known because it is not dramatic, and it does not fit the narrative of Meyer Lansky as either pure villain or pure financial genius. It is simply a man trying to do right by people he is responsible for, in the limited way that is available to him, before the situation makes even those limited acts impossible. It tells you something about him that the financial architecture alone does not tell you. The financial architecture tells you about his mind. The quiet assistance to his Cuban staff tells you about something underneath the mind, about the values that operate in the register below strategy, where a person decides what they actually owe to the people in their orbit. Meyer Lansky decided that he owed something, and he paid it, in the way he could pay it, before the revolution ended his ability to pay anything. In the years after Cuba, the Havana that Meyer built becomes a kind of fixed point in his imagination, not nostalgically. He is not a man given to nostalgia, which is an emotion that requires a certain kind of relationship to the past that his particular temperament does not support. He does not look backward with longing, but Havana represents something specific in his mental map of what he has done and what it cost. It is the place where the visible empire was most visible, where the gap between what he had built in the physical world and what he operated in the invisible world was most dramatic, where the furniture was most magnificent and the house most carefully hidden. He gives one interview in the late 1960s in which he is asked about Havana. The journalist asks if he misses it. Meyer thinks for a moment, and then says something that the journalist finds puzzling but records carefully. He says that you can miss a place without mourning it, that missing something and mourning it are different. Mourning requires that you believe the thing should have lasted longer than it did. Missing simply means that you remember it was good when it was there. He says Havana was good when it was there. The best of what he built. The most complete version of the vision. And he misses it in the way that you miss something that was exactly what it was supposed to be, for exactly as long as it was supposed to be, and then ended. The journalist asks about the money. Meyer smiles and says he does not know what the journalist is referring to. The journalist notes that Meyer's smile is the most informative thing he says in the entire interview. Somewhere in the careful, patient, invisible architecture that Meyer built in the months before the revolution, the substance of the Havana empire still exists. Transformed by now through decades of investment and reinvestment into forms that bear no traceable relationship to the casino revenue of 1955 or 1956 or 1957. Growing in the dark, the way properly structured capital grows, compounding and branching and becoming something larger and more diffuse than what it started as. The revolutionary government never found it. The FBI never found it. The IRS never found it. The forensic accountants who have spent careers trying to reconstruct the financial history of the organized crime era have gotten close to understanding the architecture, but never close to the specific accounts and the specific balances. It is the ultimate expression of what Meyer Lansky spent his life building. Not the hotels, not even the casinos, but this. The ability to move $300 million out of the reach of a revolution, out of the reach of 50 years of federal investigation, out of the reach of every specific threat that targeted it, and into the permanent safety of genuine invisibility. The money that is nowhere because it is everywhere. The empire that cannot be seized because it has no fixed address. The house that went with him when they took the furniture. That is the Cuba escape. That is the full measure of what Meyer Lansky was, expressed in the act that most completely demonstrates it. Not violence, not power in the visible sense, but precision, patience. The ability to see what is coming before it arrives and to act on that vision with a completeness and a thoroughness that leaves nothing to chance. The ability to build something and let it go and keep what matters and leave behind what can be taken. The wisdom to know the difference between furniture and house, and the discipline to move the house before anyone else knows the furniture is at risk. On the Malecón in Havana, the Riviera Hotel still stands. The chandeliers that Meyer chose are still there, or versions of them. The view of the Caribbean that he paid for is still there, exactly as it always was. The building sits in the Cuban sun the way it has sat for more than 60 years now, carrying in its architecture the memory of a specific vision, a specific decade, a specific moment when one man looked at an underdeveloped city and saw what it could become and built it. The building is the furniture. It is magnificent furniture. It is furniture that has outlasted the man who built it and will outlast most of the people who will ever read this story. But the house is gone. The house went north on New Year's morning in 1959 on a plane over the Straits of Florida, in the mind and the arrangements and the invisible architecture of a man in a conservative dark suit who had finished his calculation, done what needed to be done, and was ready for whatever came next. The way Meyer Lansky was always ready. The way he always had been from the time he was a 13-year-old boy on a Lower East Side street corner, watching and calculating and seeing, always seeing, what everyone else had not yet learned to look for.